So welcome to the HR Huddle. I'm Eloise Shelton of Vanilla Recruitment and founder of the HR Huddle. We specialise in recruiting HR, marketing, office and accountancy roles. Our speaker today is a specialist inclusion consultant, coach, TEDx speaker and host of the Speaking of Inclusion podcast. With a background in both commercial leadership and HR and a unique approach to DE&I without the BS, Katie understands the challenges faced by businesses right now. And today she's going to help us to find the confidence to have the conversations that really matter without the fear of putting our foot in it. So today's session will last approximately an hour. It is going to be recorded. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself as we're going along or put them in the chat box and we can get through as many as we can. There's also going to be time for questions at the end of the session. So if you want to wait to the end, that's fine. So I am delighted to welcome and pass over to Katie Allen. Thank you for joining us.
Super. Thank you so much for that introduction, Eloise. And good morning, everybody, but we're past that now, aren't we? Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all having a lovely day so far. Oh, it's nice to see everybody filing in now. For those of you that are comfortable, it's always wonderful for me if you can turn your cameras on because I love to just see some faces. It's nice to know that I'm actually speaking to people, but obviously I do appreciate not everybody is either able to or would like to, so I'm also okay if people want to leave them turned off. So I'll leave that one up with you. When it comes to kind of engagement on this, I know Eloise has already kind of covered this a little bit, but just for absolute clarity, if you have questions as we're going along, I want this to be as interactive as you would like it to be. So if you would like to come off mute and ask a question, I'm perfectly fine with that. I also appreciate not everybody wants to come off mute in front of a group of strangers and ask things. So if you don't want to, then obviously the chat box is there and Eloise is going to keep an eye on that for us. So I will keep remembering, hopefully, to give a pause in places so that she can interrupt me and ask those questions. So if you do have questions, please do drop them in there, especially if you're coming with something specific in mind with a topic or an issue that you've been facing. Pop it in the chat now because that will give us a good opportunity to make sure we cover that for you. And also it would be really great for me as well if you're happy to share or just to think for yourself, what is it that you're hoping to get out of our session today? Because I know it's quite a broad topic, isn't it? This kind of getting over the fear of saying the wrong thing and creating confidence in the DEI space. So it'd be good for me just to understand from each of you if you're here for kind of maybe general awareness or if there's something specific that you're looking for. So if you can give us a bit of an indication in the chat, that would also be fantastic. And I guess for the benefit of your interactions with one another, if you want to introduce yourself to each other, have at it, because it's always nice to know who we're on a call with, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, wonderful. What I will do is I'm going to start sharing because of course I've got slides. So hopefully you can see that now. So today we are going to be talking, let me just change the view so I can see you all. There we go. We are going to be talking about getting confident when it comes to the world of diversity, equity and inclusion, specifically from an HR lens. So the stuff that we're going to cover is I really want to focus primarily on the role of psychological safety, because I'm sure this is a topic that will resonate with you. You will probably have an understanding of it somewhat already. But I would really like to kind of delve into that a little bit deeper so we can talk about the stages of psychological safety and pose a few questions as to how are we creating that within our workplaces. On the topic of psychological safety, as far as I'm concerned, this forum is an open discussion forum. So please, ask whatever you wish that's going to give you the most value and benefit from the session. Please, can I also ask that you do treat each other and respect the confidentiality and suspend judgment of one another, because this is a safe space for having difficult conversations and we don't want to undermine that. But again, remember that it's recorded. So if you have got something particularly tricky or personal or specific to your organization that you don't want sharing, maybe drop that in like an anonymous question to Eloise directly, and then we can figure out a way for answering that for you differently. And again, if anyone has got anything that is particularly complex or might require an in-depth answer, we can park those questions and we can come back to you directly as well, one-to-one, to make sure you do get an answer that maybe if it's not relevant to everybody. We will then, once we've talked about psychological safety, start talking about the fear of getting things wrong and why do we have this fear? Why is it when it comes to having these tricky conversations about our identities and including people that actually we all get a little bit scared? So we're going to cover that in a bit more depth, and we're going to use a tool where we will examine our frames of reference. So for me, this is kind of the crux of the work, which is understanding, how do I see the world? How do other people see the world? And where do our values and beliefs and ideas based upon that kind of have some synergy, or where do they change? And then obviously when we get to the end, we're going to talk about how do we reflect on this? Are there any tips that I can share that might help this, help you with this to make it a bit easier? And we'll have a bit of a Q&A time as well. So you can literally ask me anything, because believe I've probably heard most of it before. And if I don't have an answer for you, I'm pretty sure we can find that out by the time the end of the call's done. So does that sound good with everybody? Awesome. Thank you.
Sounds great,
Oh, actually,
Katie.
sorry. Yeah.
Sounds great.
Thank you. One thing to know is there's a lot of content that I'm going to share with you today. So I have already sent a copy of the slide deck to Eloise to share with you all, with some more comprehensive notes in there as well. So you don't have to worry about scribbling everything down. But if you're like me and you like to write stuff down for yourself anyway, obviously please do. But I just want you to know that you're going to get a copy of all the materials anyway. So who am I? This might be a nice place to start, because who is this person with her bright shiny jumper standing in front of you? So my name is Katie Allen. I use the pronouns she and her. And essentially, my background is in HR management, and I ran a commercial industrial petrochemical cleaning company for quite a while. And that is what set me on my journey of inclusion, because I'm sure, as you can imagine, working in that field isn't necessarily the most inclusive when you're a woman. And that was kind of my first introduction to what does it feel like to maybe not be part of an in crowd. And through that work, I then retrained in HR, thinking this is how I'm going to change the world, and I'm going to be the best business partner because I've got all this commercial experience. Now I've got the HR experience. Watch out, everybody, I'm taking over. And then I kind of had that experience where I realized, yes, I was excellent at my job, but there are also very specific challenges that we face in HR that from a business context can make our lives quite tricky. And how am I then going to implement the change I wanted to see from an inclusion perspective, also that could meet business needs and still stay within the correct confines of all the HR rules and regulations that we have to worry about. So that's what set me to setting up my own organisation. So it's an inclusion consultancy. I have no imaginative name, I'm afraid. It's Katie Allen Consulting, because what I lack for in creativity, I absolutely make up for in the fact that I know what I'm talking about. So this is why I've ended up on the journey that I am. I'm also a confidence coach, and I have a podcast as well called Speaking of Inclusion, where I invite guests along really to talk all about the content, then have conversations that maybe we wouldn't normally have. And I want to share that with as many people as possible, because I think it's through listening to the experiences of others that really helps us kind of learn more about ourselves and the way we navigate the world. So that's me in a nutshell. So first topic, psychological safety. How familiar are we with this topic? Because it's become quite a leadership buzz now, isn't it? We're all talking about psychological safety. So is this familiar with people? If you want to give me a thumbs up or a yeah. Okay, so we've definitely got some people that yeah, thank you. It's definitely got some people that are familiar with this. So I won't go into it. Well, no, actually, I'm going to go into it too much because
I was going to say, Katie, just give it a quick overview if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I will. So it is a term, actually, it's been around a lot longer than we think, because it's only in more recent years that it seems to have really found its way into leadership lexicon. And it was popularized kind of back in the late 90s, early thousands by Amy Edmondson when she did her work into it. And her work originally centered around the outcomes of surgeries. So she did a big research project into when in surgical environments, if scrub nurses were in a psychologically safe environment, so this meant they were in an environment where they could speak up, where they could challenge and they could ask questions, surgical outcomes for patients were exponentially better in those environments than in environments where they were not able to do that, and they just essentially did as they were told or stayed quiet when they saw things were going wrong. So she's the person who popularized the term, but actually it's been kicking around since about the 50s. So it is something that has been talked about and researched for quite a long time, and it's only now that we're really starting to draw the arc between the importance of psychological safety and actually our workplace environment and how this helps us function as teams. And there's a really fantastic piece of work by Timothy Clark, and he talks all around the 4 stages of psychological safety. So he has those stages as being included. So am I, for the very first gatepost, am I included in a space, and can I feel safe in that space? So essentially, is who I am as a person welcome into this space? So that's included. And then the second stage is around, can I be a learner? Which means, okay, so I'm in the space, but can I participate actively and can I learn from what is happening within this group or within this team or in this environment? And then the third stage is around contributor safety. So this is, okay, I'm welcome in the space, I can participate as an active learner, but can I also contribute to the group and feed back my own thoughts for the benefit of others as well? And then the fourth and final stage is around being a challenger. And what this means is, okay, I'm welcome, I can participate as a learner, I can give my own thoughts and exchange ideas, and I can speak up and challenge things if I don't agree with something, or I can share an opinion that may be less popular, or I can, challenge. Essentially, it's the fourth stage, how to be a challenger. So how can I participate through that lens as well? So for me, it's this work of Timothy Clark that really takes it a little bit further and helps us understand, when we're talking about psychological safety, how are we measuring that? And how are we looking at the ways in which people are participating? So what I would like to ask of you, maybe in the chat, this might be a good thing to do. When it comes to those four stages, and if we know essentially challenger is kind of the gold star, so I can go to work, I can be myself, I can contribute in discussions, and if I need to, I can speak up and challenge things without the fear of retribution or without the fear of something negative happening to me as a result. Would you all say that that is something that you kind of feel is present within your own organizations? And let's do it through the lens of for yourself. So can you actively participate as a challenger within your organization? And I realize there could be some caveats on this, so answers can probably range from yes all the time or sometimes, depends on the group, but it'd be interesting just to get a gauge. So Eloise, good. It's a good job you can, Eloise, otherwise we're gonna have a problem, aren't we?
I was going to say, I'd expect me to, yeah.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of yeses coming in. It depends on the circumstances. I think that's probably a quite accurate representation for a lot of places, and that most of the time we might feel that way, but there possibly could be some times that we might find ourselves being a little bit hesitant or less inclined to speak up. So yes, depending on the audience, absolutely. Important to challenge and to understand the time and the methods. Yes, again, understanding the audience in terms of how do I feel safe, but also the safety of the audience that I'm with. Because oftentimes if we're in a more senior position, sometimes we have to think about how are we challenging to make sure that we're not destroying the psychological safety for the rest of the group. Awesome, good. Okay, so for me, that's a really good gauge, because when it comes to having conversations around inclusion specifically, so maybe this might be another thing to reflect upon. When we think about having those conversations, does that change how psychologically safe you feel to challenge? So for example, if you're in a meeting and you hear someone say something that it kind of stops you in your tracks and you think, I don't think you can say that, or I'm not sure that I'm comfortable with that being said. How would you feel then? Would you still feel that the same rules would apply, or does it shift it slightly?
Oh God.
Okay, so yes, we've got some people who speak out. So uncomfortable, but yes, I feel empowered to speak up. And again, yeah, it depends on the circumstances for sure. Yeah. Because oftentimes when we have this conversation, this can be where we might see some of that shift, is that if it's something that maybe we're more used to speaking up about, then it can be a lot easier. But actually, when it comes to challenging things, especially when it comes to things such as racism or misogyny or ableism, we can find ourselves really having that courage to speak up, hinging on our own capacity to understand those topics and our own capacity to know whether or not we're going to get it right before we speak up, or how it's going to be received from the group that we're in. So yes, so possibly not in public, depending on the circumstances, but follow up afterwards, absolutely. So advocating for others, but to challenge on the behalf of others and for the benefit of others. Yeah, that's a really great approach. I like that. Okay. So from a psychological safety perspective, what I would also like then for you to kind of be thinking about is we're going to talk as we go through the model that I'm going to introduce you to in a second around how are we creating psychological safety. So this exercise has really been reflecting on how we feel and how psychologically safe we feel, but how do we then create those scenarios and situations where the people that we have within our teams and within our organisation also feel that same level of safety? Because is the high level of challenger safety that you experience the same for other people within your organisation, and especially for maybe junior level people as well? Okay. So when it comes to speaking up, and I really like your kind of your openness here as well in terms of engaging with thinking about actually it might be a bit more challenging to speak up if it was on a topic I'm less familiar with, or if maybe if it's in a public setting. And the number one thing that I hear when I have my workshops is we're okay having the kind of conversations generally, but 9 times out of 10, most people don't want to offend other people. Like we want to speak up and we want to do the right thing, but we don't want to get things wrong. We don't want to be judged for maybe not knowing, what is the right or wrong thing to say. And we certainly don't want to upset the people that we're supposed to be kind of speaking up on behalf of or to support. So one thing that I do want to kind of call out here is when we think about those feelings that we get. So in the example I gave, if you're in a room and you hear someone say something and you have that moment within you where you think, yeah, I'm not comfortable with that. And sometimes you'll have that kind of, it's almost like a physical emotional response that happens where it catches you and you think, that's not okay. And then you go to say something, and 9 times out of 10, the reasons that when we get stopped from saying that thing, it's that fear that comes up. It's that blocker that can catch us before we do, that can just make us be like, oh, yeah, actually, I don't know if I can say that or if I can challenge that, and I don't know what's going to happen if I do. And that fear that arises, that kind of, usually it's a fear of judgment. That's this fight or flight instinct with us. It's a survival instinct that harks back to the days when we used to live in small communities. And it was really imperative that basically we didn't frustrate or annoy all the people that we had living in our community, because we were absolutely dependent upon them for our survival. So it was absolutely paramount that we stayed safe physically and psychologically so that we didn't get kicked out of our in-group. So as a human species, we are really pre-wired to live in these in-groups and be dependent on one another. But where it has obviously shifted is the fact that no longer are we absolutely dependent on a life or death scenario when it comes to relying on one another. The problem is our amygdala doesn't know that. So those feelings of fear or kind of trepidation perhaps that might arise within us when we want to say something, and then we catch ourselves thinking, oh, actually, I don't know if I can challenge that, or maybe I need to have a conversation separately. It's generally because there is something within us that's saying, yeah, but if you say that and you don't get it right, or if you say that and it's not received very well and this person's in a position of power in relation to you, that might have negative consequences for me. And that's what triggers our amygdala to be like, no, that's not safe. And it'll either be, run away, don't say anything, pretend it never happened, turn a blind eye, or it will be, oh, okay, well, I will say something, but I'll have to do it later in a scenario that it is safe. And I need to try and find a situation where I don't feel triggered like that. And maybe I'll think and pre-plan about what I want to say. And all of those things are okay. But when it comes to the work of DEI, one of the real barriers can be is letting that fear be the thing that dictates whether or not we actually do anything at all. So I know, even working in this field and spending so much time really trying to get familiar with what is the correct terminology to use, how do you say things, how do I engage with people, there are still times I feel those moments creeping up inside me. Like, for an example, I was recording a podcast at the end of last week and I was talking to somebody about racism, and we were talking about it specifically in a recruitment capacity. And there was something in me that really prompted me from digging in as far as I wanted to in talking specifically about anti-Black racism. And I really had to kind of call it out within this conversation to say, there's something in me that's stopping me from asking the specific question that I want to ask. But I named it and said it anyway, because I knew I had to acknowledge that as a person racialized as white, that was something was going on within me. And that was something that I had to deal with. So we all have these moments. It doesn't matter how kind of involved in the work you are. There will always be a thing that's going to be your thing that might stop you from speaking up. But it's about how do we tune in and make sure that that fear doesn't become a barrier to stopping us getting to where we need to be. And that's what we're going to dig into today.
Great. Katie, one small thing. It's been a request for you to talk slightly slower, if you don't
Oh,
mind.
apologies. Yes.
Just for some people on the call.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Of course, of course.
I know we get very excited when we're talking.
Yeah, sorry, I do get a little bit overzealous. I've just realised as well, I've managed to click on the option. Oh, never mind. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I didn't realise at the top of this thing I can toggle between viewing my own screen or viewing the meeting screen, and I've managed to click my own screen. I thought that's exciting. I can't see anyone. Anyway, so that is when we're talking about fear, where we get to. So what I would like to do now is share with you a model that I've been using that will help us get to a point of being able to explore that, and then working through the various frames of reference that we each have, so that we can then find a way of articulating how we feel, tuning into our emotions, and really changing the way that we can have those communications. So as I said, I'm a simple soul. I like to keep things really simple. So the model I use when I think about frames of reference is this. It's 3 concentric circles, the center one being me, the second middle circle being us, and the outer circle being we. And essentially, this is a way of looking at how are the different ways and contexts in which we view the world shaping the way in which we are having our conversations. So in developing this model, it's about recognizing that we are all products of our environment. So we are all created by the fact that we are born into the families we're born into, in the countries that we are born into, with the people who raise us and the circumstances we find ourselves in, and all of those things shape who we are. So our identity characteristics, our socialization. And each of those things comes with different kind of advantages and opportunities that we may or may not have. And each of those things is really contextual when it comes to having these conversations. So to just go through each of these sections of the model, when we think about me, I really want you to think of this in terms of the only thing that you can ever really truly know is what it's like to be you. So your experiences, your views on the world, what has led you to the position that you have led yourself to, that's how you see the world. So me is this default position. And when we've got this kind of me mindset, we are really thinking about our own personal safety. We're thinking about our personal needs. We're thinking about our own assumptions, our biases that shape our thoughts and behaviors. So all of the things that are going on for us. So I want you to just take a few minutes and just think about, what is it that you know about yourself? So, what is your identity? How are you racialized? What are your kind of religious or spiritual beliefs or not? Do you navigate the world where you have a disability in certain environments? Do you have some neurodivergence? Are you a member of the LGBTQI plus community? Like, what are the things that have shaped who you are? Did you grow up kind of in a countryside or in a city? Did you grow up surrounded by people, or did you have a very small family? All of these things, where were you educated? To what level were you educated? All of these things will shape who you are. So just take a minute and have a think about that, because each of those things will be the things that kind of I've got menopause brain, I've lost the word, that possess, there we go, that kind of show in what scenarios you might possess elements of power and elements of privilege as a result of that. And in certain scenarios, that will shift and change. So have a think about that. And then while you're thinking about that, if you can ask yourself, if me is your default position, and you're thinking about what do you know about yourself and your own identity, how does that influence the way that you approach your work? So if you're, doing a policy review and you've thought about your frame of reference, how does that influence the way in which you are conducting that policy review? when you are doing an investigation? How does that influence how you see the scenarios that are playing out? And how do you put yourself in the shoes of other people to think, okay, well, how might that be different? Oh, I see we've got Alex has put a question about
Yeah, I
elements
was
of
gonna say-
power and privilege. Can you expand on the distinction? Okay, yes. So when we think about privilege, this will be kind of scenarios where we find ourselves with a certain level of opportunity or unearned advantage as a result of likely nothing that we've done. So if I think about myself, I'm a person racialized as white, and that gives me certain privileges within life. So it means that there are certain barriers that I do not face as a result of the way that I'm racialized. I don't navigate the world with a disability. So there are almost all environments I can find myself in where I can access services, I can access or any kind of offerings or resources without having to modify anything that I do. So that is a privilege where I don't experience a barrier. And then when we think about the power that comes with that, so because I don't have additional obstacles to overcome, therefore that gives me access, to greater opportunity. Therefore, the likelihood that I will find myself in a position of power, or people in positions of power are likely to share those same characteristics as me. Therefore, when decisions are made, they're more likely to mirror my needs, my expectations. So it kind of leads into that. Does that answer your question, Alex?
I think so, thank you.
Okay, cool. So it's about thinking, and we have to think, we're going to come on in a minute to talk about intersectionality. So we also have to think we aren't any one thing when we talk about our own identity. We aren't any one thing. We are the combination of those things. So that's why I say it's contextual. There will be some scenarios where I won't face any barriers, but I'm also a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. So there will be some scenarios where I absolutely do. So it's about the shifting levels of privilege that I experience. So when you're thinking about that, it's really important that we think about how does this approach the way that we conduct our work? How does this approach the way that we interact with people and the people that we work with? And what impact might that have on the policies or processes that you implement within your organizations if we aren't thinking wider than that me frame of reference? And the one thing we have to remember then, as we build on that, is that our brains love a shortcut. So coming back to the kind of the primitive brain that we have, it is wired to process literally millions of bits of information. So neurologically, we have to make shortcuts to filter that information. Otherwise, we'd literally just spend our time spinning. So what happens is the more that we are familiar with something, the more we are likely for our brain to take a shortcut. And this is where our biases and our assumptions come into play. So these are things that appear to be more familiar to us, and therefore we are likely to process them at a quicker speed and less likely to question them. And this is where these things creep in. So when we start thinking about this us community, our us mindset, generally this is where we find ourselves acting within the best interests of the people who are immediately around us. So if we think about our friends and our family and our kind of communities and the people we're most connected with. So our brain, naturally, when it's taking these shortcuts, it has a preference to avoid different. So we are most likely, when we're having this us mindset, to surround ourselves with people who are just like us. And this again this is where we have to notice and pay attention to where our biases are creeping in that way. So this can feel like a really safe space. This can feel like we are surrounded by people who think the same as us, feel the same as us. So from a psychological safety perspective, this is nice. However, this is also where polarization and echo chambers are created, because if we're only surrounding ourselves with people who see the world the same way that we do, then we're only going to reinforce all of the messages that we already know. So when we think about being in this us mindset, who is in your us group? In what ways are they similar to you, and in what ways are they different? And how does that shape your thinking? Does that make sense? Everyone with me?
Yes. Yep.
Awesome. So thinking from our me mindset is when we put ourselves at the center, and then our us mindset is when we move beyond that and we start thinking about, you know, a more wider group, but generally it's limited to the people that we are most connected with. And how are we exploring those connections for noticing where those people are the same as us and where those people are different to us? Yes, confirmation bias. Thank you, Priya. Yeah, absolutely that. So this, when we talk about our biases being formed in that way, this is exactly where they will come from. So people who, and how many times have we had conversations in HR years ago when we used to put hobbies on the bottom of a CV, right? We don't do that anymore. But, you know, you're reading that. If I see someone who loves the Bake Off and is an Aston Villa football fan, I'm like, this person's great. Awesome. And we know that that has got absolutely nothing to do with who they are. It's just an affinity that I might have with them. And I might see something in them that maybe is or isn't there. And to Priya's point about confirmation bias, as I then read the rest of that CV, I'm only probably going to consciously notice the things that reinforce my belief that this person's a great person to begin with. So we really have to kind of check ourselves for what's going on in there. And of course, the opposite is true. You know, we can make negative assumptions about people, and then our brains will naturally filter and notice the things that fit that narrative much more quickly than they will fit the things that maybe don't. So how are we tuning into that? And then before we move into thinking about actually getting things wrong does not make you a bad person. And this is something that I really want people to think about, because we are becoming a society now where we are increasingly thinking in binary positions. You know, something is good or something is bad, something is right, something is wrong. But getting things wrong, especially in a DEI space, does not make you a bad person. It makes you human. And I can tell you now that you cannot possibly know everything about every other person walking this earth. It's just not going to happen. And I am immersed in this work all of the time, and I am still learning, because there is always something more to uncover. So there's no definition of done when it comes to this. So all we can ever do is the best that we can do until we learn something new or we gain new information. And we can only do that essentially through being willing to make mistakes and step outside of our comfort zone into the we mindset. So this is when we're really thinking about and feeling on behalf of and acting in support of the longer term advancement of everybody. And when we think about the us mindset as being that's really safe, comfortable, that's, you know, that's a nice place to be in, this we mindset is not. This can be really difficult. This can feel uncomfortable. You know, we have to really step into that space with a lot of curiosity, being prepared to have dialogue and really listening to people whose opinions, thoughts, experiences are different to ours, in search of us being able to learn something and take something away from that. So when you are in a we mindset and you are being curious and you're having open dialogue, how are you thinking about using that information so that you can create psychologically safe and physically safe environments, not just for people who are like you, but for people who are different to you as well? So how are you spending time outside of the us comfort zone to immerse yourself in learning opportunities to learn about people who are different? So people who have got different ethnicities to you, who are racialized differently to you, with different religious or spiritual beliefs. How are we exploring that so that we can have a better understanding? And it's probably at this time, I know often people tend to ask me questions about labels when we get to this point. And we think about, okay, but actually now if we start talking about all of the differences that we have, are we just labeling one another? Are we going down a route of only seeing people rather than whole humans, seeing them as just a label? And wouldn't it be amazing just to get rid of labels? And the answer to that question is yes, of course, it would be amazing if we didn't have to think about each other in terms of all these different identity characteristics that we have. And you would just meet me and be, oh, this is Katie, and get to know me for who I am. But essentially, for all the reasons we've said, that's just not how we function as human beings. We are processing all the time. We are filtering. So actually having labels can be a really useful way to be able to describe to one another how our different experiences manifest, how our different identity characteristics shape who we are, shape how we see the world, so that we can explore that together and learn something about one another. And essentially, in our role in HR, we have to really start kind of delving beneath those labels to understand the experiences of people, so that we can make sure that's reflected in the way in which we run our organizations, essentially. Does that all make sense? Is everyone with me? Awesome. So some reflective questions then that I'd really like for you to be thinking about. When you think through those frames of reference, what are the gaps that you have kind of come up with? If you think about your me frame of reference and how you see the world, and then you extrapolate that out and think about, okay, what are people who are very different to me? Where might some of your gaps be, and your experiential gaps that you hadn't really thought about? And how can you perhaps use some resources that are outside of your current comfort zone? Because often we consume news in the same way. We might use the same social media channels. We might, if we use LinkedIn as a source of connecting with one another, are we following content creators who produce something different to what we normally would follow to give us a different perspective? Or are we only staying with our own connection base? How are we actively going outside of that to find information and consume information that gives us something new and different? If anyone's willing, I'd really like to kind of maybe see in the chat if there's anything coming up for you that you're noticing. Because again, in community space like this, sharing your kind of thoughts and observations, if there's other people that maybe aren't connecting with it so well, that could really help them to go, yes, I see that now. So if anyone's willing to share, that would be fantastic. Or come off mute if anybody's feeling chatty. I'm always welcome for a chat.
I think people go quite shy with them with some of these things, Katie.
No, and that's fair enough, and for all the reasons that we're talking about, right?
Absolutely.
So while you're processing that, have a think about that. Think about where you're kind of consuming information and how you can use different information. And also think, when we talked at the start about the emotions that we notice within ourselves, what are the situations that make you feel most vulnerable? And tune into not just the feelings that you experience. So for example, I know if I find myself kind of thinking, oh gosh, I've got a question, is this the right forum to ask it? Because oftentimes I have a lot of questions and I'm very curious about things, and I have to check myself to think, is this the right time to ask this? Is this the right time to position this? I have to tune into within me. So what's my feeling? My feeling might be frustration. My feeling might be annoyance, sometimes even anger when I'm hearing things. And then physically, how does that manifest within myself? Like, is it preventing me from really listening to someone else? Have I heard someone say something that triggers my own values and beliefs, and my brain's gone into fight mode, where it's like, no, that's terrible. How can you think that? How do I pause that? How do I bring that back down again and think, okay, I'm feeling a response to this, but I need to listen to what this person is saying to be able to understand why they're saying what they're saying, so that we can keep this as a dialogue. Because essentially this is where we're at in HR, right? We can't just keep turning around to people going, that's ridiculous. Why do you think that? Like we can't do that, and we shouldn't do that. We should be engaging in dialogue, regardless of what our inner monologue might be telling us. So how are we tuning into those emotions and noticing what they're telling us about ourselves, and how we can use that to connect with other people? Marion, so just noticed in the chat, you've got culture in different regions is important in my company. We share customs and what we do in leisure time in our co-newsletter. Excellent. So that's a way of, in community within your organisation, sharing what everybody is up to and kind of creating that sense of familiarity across the team. I really like that as an idea. So yeah, so that's great. So there is a way of knowing then if you are reading something in that company newsletter, you're learning something about people within your organisation that maybe you wouldn't know before. And that's a way of moving into a different frame of reference. And Priya constantly challenges yourself to go out of your comfort zone, but vulnerability comes when people have a pre-notion about you based on your race, gender, etc. For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Because there absolutely will be times, won't there, when we want to step outside of our comfort zone to learn something for ourselves, but we also don't know how that's going to be received. We also don't know whether we're going to be welcome and safe outside of that comfort zone. So there's a fine balance there, isn't there? And the judgment of others based upon what do they think about me and how do I create that conversation? And sometimes naming that. So when we notice those emotions creeping in, naming that as part of the conversation can be so helpful. So I've often used, I have a question that I want to ask. I'm feeling a sense of frustration about why I want to ask it, or I'm hesitant to share it because I'm worried that it might be met with judgment. Is it okay for me to ask? You know, how can we notice what's going on and using that? I was going to say as a presupposition, but I don't know if that's the correct term. But anyone, I guess, who's doing GCSE English at the minute will probably tell me that's right or wrong. But you know, how can we use that to caveat the thing that we're about to say to create more psychological safety within the space? How can we say, hearing you say that is bringing some emotions up for me. It's making me feel quite frustrated. I'm having a bit of a reaction to that. Can we talk more about that? You know, how do you notice that and use that information to keep the conversation going? And then the same then works around acting as an ally. So when you are in spaces surrounded by other people and you notice other people's emotional reactions or other people's responses or other people's language and words and actions, how are you noticing that? And how are you kind of using that as well to begin conversation or to challenge? How are you noticing what's happening within the room, but also who is not in the room when those decisions are being made or outcomes are being created? Who isn't there or represented at all? And how can you notice that? And then think, okay, in this room, we are all a group of cisgender people, for example. How are we thinking about if we had somebody who was transgender or non-binary or gender fluid in the room, how would this impact them? How are we having that conversation? Yeah, how are we stepping outside into that we space to act as an ally for people who aren't in the room to vocalize for themselves? And I'd be curious to know how many of you and how often kind of have those sort of reflective conversations with yourself or with each other if you're part of a team. How does that come up for you?
Your eyes, David, your eyes.
Was that-
them.
Is that a question, Cheryl? I'm sorry, we can't hear you very well.
Oh, but yeah. Catherine was so proud of that one. Oh,
No, I don't think it is.
No, I don't think so.
Sorry, I'll just mute.
On the subject of some background noise, my cat has just woken up and decided to join us, and Eloise and I were talking about this earlier, that she is also very vocal. So we'll welcome her to the conversation in a moment when she comes to find me.
Yeah, when she comes on, sits on your shoulders.
Zoom's pretty good at the minute, so I don't know that you'll hear her, but she shall arrive. So how are we all, where are we all at with this currently? How are we all processing? Because are we taking some quite reflective time? Is this, you know, how is this meeting you where you were thinking?
Personally, Katie, I think being very reflective about myself and probably even your conversations I have with my team, I don't think I give it enough consideration of how I speak
Mm.
with the team. I think that's probably something I need to think about more.
Yeah. I mean, one for me is I've had a lot of conversations recently with people, and it's really small, but it's been really popular. Certainly when people are generating sort of social media content, especially on LinkedIn, there's been a real trend, hasn't there, in using AI generated images, which that's a whole conversation perhaps for another day from an environmental impact perspective. But people are really quick and bringing all these images, which is fantastic. And then we're not putting those images back into AI to ask for an image description when we upload it. So we're automatically sharing all these images, but we're not thinking about people who use screen readers to access those images. So it's like AI is such a fantastic tool in that way, and we're only half using it. So how can we run it back through, get an alternative text image? How can we run that back through? And then we can make the content we're creating more accessible to more people. So just little things like that. And that, you know, I found myself talking about that so much because I think to do it. But if I don't tell people, how do we know? Because if no one says that to us, the amount of people that go, oh yeah, I'd never thought of that. Like, yeah,
No,
'cause if we don't
I
share
wouldn't
it,
think about it.
yeah.
And when we post to LinkedIn a lot. So there's a couple of comments.
Yes.
Again from Alex, saying, yeah, particularly with remote camera off events like this, you can't tell which people or groups are present. And she's obviously shared some things about herself. And Barry, in meetings at work, I've always found it very challenging when the term guys is used for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. So
And
yeah,
we,
Alex,
and we do it naturally, don't we?
yeah. To Alex's question there, so about being oh, sorry, it's just dropped down. So yeah, so you completely good point there, Alex. When cameras are turned off, we don't know who is who. So there's a reason that I always introduce myself with my pronouns, because I want people to be able to address me correctly. So for me, that's really important. I make sure I display them in places because I think I'm of a gender that I identify with the gender I was assigned at birth, and therefore it's less likely that I get misgendered. But I recognise that people do get misgendered. So my act of allyship in this is to always make sure I introduce myself with my pronouns to encourage people to start thinking about that in going into conversation. So for Alex saying, you know, they use the pronouns they, them, that means that when they introduce themselves, they will likely have to introduce themselves using their pronouns to make sure that they are not misgendered. So in making sure that if we can all adopt that as practice, and I don't mandate ever, I don't advocate mandating the use of pronouns personally, because I think we have to be really careful that we don't force people into a position where they actively have to then identify as a gender. Maybe if they are questioning or on their transition journey, we don't want to force people into a position where they have to identify as a gender where they're maybe not ready to. So I don't ever say like mandate it, at least not without education. But it's useful to start introducing it into conversation so that it takes the pressure off when people do want to use you know, pronouns that maybe people wouldn't naturally associate with them. We can help by all actively participating in that. And again, yes, so and thanks, Alex, for saying as well, we don't know if there is anybody disabled in this audience. So for example, another thing we can do is making sure we always have closed captions enabled, so that if people are participating and they need that as a resource, wherever possible, make that as standard. You know, when you put content out, again, I use LinkedIn a lot, always make sure I put captions on. A, because it makes it more accessible, and B, because most people consume content without sound anyway. So it makes it more accessible for everybody.
Amy's asked a good question, if I don't mind sharing. So they're very conscious of including and adapting, etc. But they're often checking and reflecting inwards, which is great. But she's mentioned that there may be some blind spots that she's still missing. How can I test for that?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. So thank you, Amy. often the only time that we can really test for that is just putting ourselves in positions where we are outside of our comfort zone and trying to consume information that is new or unfamiliar to us. So Teapot, nobody cares what you've got to say, not for a minute. So really it's about how do we connect with people who are different, and how do we get a window into an experience that is different that might kind of trigger a light bulb moment for us. And really a lot of that comes from either podcasts and kind of exploring content, YouTube videos, that kind of stuff, actively seeking out. If you think, I mean, there are millions of TED Talks out there now. Just have a general browse and see if you can come up with something that goes, oh, that's interesting. I hadn't, don't know what that title is. There, always there are books, always there are online content creators who are bringing new topics. Interestingly, TikTok, fantastic resource for very short snippets of information, and it can give you a spark where you think, that's interesting, I don't know anything about that. And then you can go away and do a little bit more research if that's a platform that you use. Again, LinkedIn and Instagram also just as good for that. So it's about how can you just connect with different sources to jostle your thinking a bit more. Because you're right, I think it's a really good point. There is only so much inward reflection we can do before we have exhausted our kind of our boundary of what we know to be true, right? So we have to connect and find different experiences. There's a really good book that I'm currently reading called The Science of Racism by Keown West. Fantastic book, highly recommended. But again, it's just bringing in different facets of a conversation that I think we can explore more. So it's about how are we challenging our thinking and just leaning into new things. Is that helpful, Amy? Yes. Okay, awesome. I mean, there are other things as well. I don't know how reliable a source it is, but there's the Harvard implicit bias test. It's horrible and it's clunky, but you can Google Harvard implicit bias test, take a whole range of bias tests, see how you score. That might be a nice insight as well, because I certainly know in the work that I do, I always score biased slightly, but always in favour of underrepresented groups. And that's something that I have to watch out, that it's a bias, but it's a bias in the direction you wouldn't expect it to be. So again, it's helping us just stay tuned in. Very quickly, because I'm going to stop sharing the slides in a minute so we can have a face-to-face. I do want to share, so Eloise did say to me, are there any kind of special offers or anything you can do specifically for the HRHuddle crew? So yes, absolutely. So what I've done is I've gone through some of my particular offerings and just thought what would be most appropriate for the audience. So I do an HR coaching power hour. So if anyone has got a specific topic on your mind that you don't really want to get into the weeds of it today, that's absolutely fine. We can have a chat about that. Let me know, but you will get an exclusive discount that is not available for anybody outside of HRHuddle. And I also do a whole host of workshops. And I've provided more of a discount levied on the HR related ones because it's more appropriate for you. And yes, if that's something of interest, this slide will also come out in the deck, so you can have a look at it yourself and reach out to me. So I know I'm really grateful that you have been dropping your questions in the chat. So that's fantastic. Is there anything else that's coming up for anybody? Any kind of key thoughts or anything else? Or maybe, Eloise, if we had any other questions that were shared
Yeah, we've had, I was
pre-session.
going to say, we've had some questions shared pre-session, if I can go through those, and that will give people time to enter anything in the chat box that they want me to cover with you. And you did touch on it during the presentation, but I don't know whether there's anything else you want to add. We had a question in that was from a person saying that they're a non-binary person, and their manager is well-meaning but ignorant about how to address and accommodate them. Are there any tips about how to support their manager in their learning? Yeah,
absolutely. So this is one of the things, isn't it? There's that whole you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So we are always finding ourselves meeting people where they are, and for a lot of times when it's directly impacting us, that's really difficult. I guess the first thing would be, is there somebody else within your team who recognises the challenge that you're having, that can also have a conversation for you to ally with you or to make some comments on your behalf, or make sure that they are correcting your manager when mistakes are made, so it's not just on your shoulders. And I guess secondly, I don't want to sound like a silly question, but have you addressed it directly with them to say, I appreciate that you are doing your best efforts, and I appreciate that this is new to you. However, this is still something that I'm finding a bit of a struggle. This is how it's impacting me. Can we have more of a conversation about that? And I know that's a difficult conversation to have, but hopefully, if your manager is well-meaning, they will take that feedback and do something with that. And I guess alternatively, there is also, if you come across a good TED talk about someone talking about the use of pronouns and gender identity, I'll do a shameless plug. I've got an episode on the Speaking of Inclusion podcast where I spoke to Kim Warren. They are also a non-binary agender person. Just send them links to stuff. Send them links, unsolicited links, and say, oh, I was listening to this and it really resonated because I experience this sometimes too. It would be really great to get your thoughts. You don't have to send it along the lines of listen to this, you need it. You can just say, I'd love to have your thoughts.
I think that's a great way. Another question we've had in, somebody else has said, in HR, we know how important the role of DE&I is, but it can be a challenge getting senior leadership buy-in. What can we do to help that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is actually a really common one, because whilst a lot of the work I do is directly with senior leadership teams, almost exclusively all of the inquiries come through HR, because you know where the challenges in your business are to begin with. And it can be oftentimes a challenge for organisations to really not see DEI work as an HR thing rather than an organisation thing, which it is. It's a leadership thing, it's a culture thing. So again, several approaches. Do you have a kind of a sponsor or someone who is more tuned in on your leadership team than perhaps others? So rather than trying to convince everybody, treat it in the same way as you would if you were trying to launch any other project, any other change management initiative. Is there one person that you can have a talk to about, actually, this is why we think it's really important, this is how it would really help us, and this is what we think would be the wider benefit for your organisation? And don't forget, because DEI isn't just an HR thing and it is a business thing, it will impact things not only about employee engagement and retention, which, let's face it, everybody is worrying about right now, but it also has an impact on your reputation within your marketplace. It also has an impact in your supply chain. Who is it that you're bringing in and working with? How do your clients know that they want to engage with you? It has an absolute business impact on everything. So, there are some tactics that you can use to say, if we did this thing, here is where else it would show up.
Fantastic. Final question, Katie. I know my organisation talks a lot about being committed to inclusion, but I'm worried that when we get an actual challenge, claim, or our commitment is tested, it's going to fall apart. How can I make sure this doesn't happen? That's a big one.
Yeah, absolutely. So it might take me more than a minute. Oh, and that's the cat. She's got opinions again. So there you go. Sorry about that. So, do you know what? Come on. Go on. So testing commitment. Yes. And that is a challenge, because we can have really good ideas and ideals, can't we? But as soon as it involves, perhaps we say we're going to have a zero tolerance approach to sexism, and then your top sales performer does something at the Christmas party, and all of a sudden we're slightly less committed to the position on that, because actually they are our top sales performer year on year. So it's about, okay, how are you pre-testing scenarios like that? If you know you've got people within your organization who are special, who seem to always be in favor, if you're creating initiatives that might challenge that, how can you have that conversation up front? That's really important. Get out ahead of it. And think about what are the ways where it can fall down. That involves, again, getting back into that we mindset. Where might you fall over? Have that conversation ahead of time, and see what you can do.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think that's all the time we've got for questions today. But if anybody's got anything else that they want to ask Katie, either feel free to contact me, or I'm sure, Katie, you know, you don't mind people contacting you directly.
No, absolutely. Please do.
so-
My contact details will be on the slides, and you can get me on LinkedIn as well.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Katie, for your time today and for going through things in such detail. Like we discussed, I will be sending out the recording next week by the time it's edited, and the slides as well, and Katie's offers. So just a couple of other announcements from myself. We've got our next HRHuddle event on the 11th of June with Keely Bajan of KSAB Law, and she's going to do us an employment law update. So those regulars will know that how fantastic she is. She's going to update us on the Employment Rights Bill. So that's a must see. You can book that via the Facebook group or on Eventbrite. We also have some exciting news that we have a new HRHuddle website that's going to be going live shortly, or soon. Not quite sure on the timescales for that, but that means it'll be much easier for you to download any policies or documents or any information that you want to see. So we'll still have the Facebook group, but the website will be in addition. And because of that, we've got a new email address. So I'll be sending emails from insights@HRHuddle. So if you don't mind adding that to your safe list so we don't go into your junk and your clutter. And finally, we are 20 years old, not the HRHuddle, but Vanilla Recruitment is now 20 years old this year. So we have, in celebration of our 20 years of recruiting, we've got a special offer that we are offering to the HRHuddle members. So I will put it in the group as well, but we're giving an exclusive 20% discount off your next piece of recruitment. So if anybody wants information on that, feel free to just reach out to me. But thank you very much. We've gone slightly over. Appreciate your time today, and I look forward to seeing you at another event. But
Thank you,
thanks again,
everybody.
Katie.